The poor old elites, they've had a problem over the years and decades and centuries because there's not many of them and there's a lot of the rest of us. And yet they manage to implement policies which are disadvantageous to the rest of us, and they get away with it. Why is that? It's not a matter of imposing it by force. It's not a matter of policing people's conformance to a system. It's enabled through the social morality.
Today on British Thought Leaders, I welcome back Rick Bradford. Rick has had a successful career in physics and engineering and is an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Bristol. He's also a world-renowned authority on men's issues, writing under the pseudonym William Collins. Rick has recently released a new book called The Destructivists, about how the usurping of morals is destroying our society. I'm Lee Hall and this is British Thought Leaders. Rick Bradford, thanks for joining us again on British Thought Leaders.
My pleasure. Again, thank you for having me twice.
You talked to us before about your book, The Empathy Gap. You have a new book out called Destructivists.
Destructivist, yeah.
Can you tell us, what is destructivism?
Yeah, it's my umbrella term for what is generally called progressivism or cultural Marxism or woke or the hard left or any one of many different themes along that time. Critical theory would be another one. So it's an umbrella term for all of them. And you'll note from the nature of the term destructivist that it's clearly pejorative. And that's because I think it's deserved. So one of the differences between the destructivists and the Empathy Gap, well, they're very different books. The Empathy Gap was, for a start, it was a very large book, and it was an exercise in compiling empirical evidence. The Destructivist is a much smaller book. It's not full of data and references. It's a quick read in comparison. And it is, and as I say immediately in the preface, that it's a book about opinion. So it's not about empirical justification. It's about opinion. And because I'm upfront about that, I feel justified in using a pejorative term for these social movements or political movements, which I do regard as all having the common feature of being destructive, either simply in their outcomes or probable outcomes, or in some cases even in their intent. So the book is much more overtly political than the previous book, and yes, it's a book of opinion. It's a book of opinion, and I make no bones about that. But I'm trying to get at the psychological and sociological origins of these phenomena that I dub destructivism.
So what is it that's being destroyed?
What they're seeking to destroy is the traditional Western culture. I say seeking to destroy it. In some cases, it is a clear objective. So the cultural Marxist angle that's a clear objective, I think. In other cases, it may not be so much an objective as something that they're happy to have happen as a collateral effect of the issues that they're more directly asserting. So that's it. It's our culture, our way of life, which is being represented as wholly reprehensible. And to achieve this, they use, they're highly selective in their view of things, very, very skewed in their view of things. So it's rather reminiscent of what I talked about last time, the constructive mendacity. They will raise a topic, but it'll be spinned in a way that sees only negatives in traditional Western approaches.
What are the key features of this moral usurpation, this talked about in the book. There is this destructivism, and how does it manifest in our society?
Yeah, yeah. What the book is trying to do is to go beyond the political level. Because most people, when they talk about these issues, it's talked about at the political level, and to my mind, that's never been a sufficient explanation of motive. So I'm trying to really get at people's motives, and how is it these ideologies have become so popular? That's the real mystery. That's the real purpose of the book. How is it woke has become so contagious? And to get at that, you have to go below the political explanation. It doesn't do you any good to say, well, it's cultural Marxism, even though that's true. It doesn't. It just leaves you the obvious question: well, why are they cultural Marxists then? What's the motivation? And motivation is always psychological. You know, it has to be, because ultimately, if you keep pressing why, you get to some psychological predisposition. So it's the psychological level I'm really interested in, and that's where moral usurpation comes in. So, moral usurpation, in my thesis, this is the explanation for the appeal of these phenomena. It's not necessarily the appeal so much as the modus operandi, I think I should say, but it is the appeal to some people. So what moral usurpation is it's a weaponization of issues which do have some genuine moral content, but it's a weaponization of them to progress an agenda which actually goes well beyond the issue in question and distorts the issue in question in pursuance of that agenda. So the actual process consists of, in the way I break it down, 5 parts, and we needn't go through all of them, but in the book I describe it in terms of moral infantilism, moral vampirism, the creation of zealots, the appeal to the elites, which is an important part of it, and the creation of positive feedback mechanisms in society which reinforce the process and make it contagious. So I'll not go through all those, but it's important to understand at least the moral infantilism part and how this operates. So what's done is a topic is taken which does have some moral content. So it might be something like violence against women and girls. So violence against women and girls is bad. No one is in favour of that, right? And the moral infantilism is to reduce that issue to just that. Violence against women and girls is bad. And then they pack in a whole load of policy below that, which is all flagged as that issue, and therefore this is how the infantilism works. If you disagree with anything that follows in the policy, that means you're disagreeing with violence against women and girls is bad, which means you think it's good, which means you're a wicked, evil person. So what the moral infantilists do is they present every issue as black and white, and you either 100% agree with them or you're 100% wicked. The idea of a difference of opinion doesn't enter into it. You're simply not allowed an opinion which is different, because all opinion which is different is morally reprehensible and therefore not permitted. This is the origin of cancel culture. This is the origin of people not being able to speak their views on campus and so on. This is the moral infantilism in action. Only one view is right. And the difference between this and having an intellectual difference of opinion is the basis of intellectual difference of opinion is dialogue. Whereas if something is morally forced, then a disagreement isn't an intellectual disagreement. It's because you're morally reprehensible and you just won't countenance it. That's how it works. That's the infantilism. So any nuance, any context, any counter-argument, And virtually any real empirical data is hidden away in this infantilism. And so it becomes a gross distortion of reality. So in the violence against women and girls aspect, oh yeah, that's, of course, that's an evil that we must try to overcome. But there will never be any spotlight of attention on violence against men and boys. There will never be any spotlight of attention on the domestic violence issue against men. So this is where I'm using this example because it meshes with what we talked about last. But you can have other examples. The way in which COVID was handled, for example, is a very obvious example of moral infantilism, where there was a monomania on controlling a disease, and any discussion around that, well, are the government interventions doing more harm than good? Do the interventions even work? And you know, in any case, is the disease as bad as it's being made out, and so on and so forth. And people are familiar with the arguments there. But all that is infantilization of the issue. A monomania on one view is right. And you saw there the vilification, in the COVID case, the vilification of people that disagreed. You know, with terms like anti-vaxxers and you're killing granny. I mean, you're killing granny is moral usurpation. That's moral coercion, without any question. So that is how an issue which has a genuine moral core, you know, because, you know, protecting people from disease is a genuine morally relevant issue, for example. That's how it is distorted and manipulated into a complete agenda which actually distorts the real issue away from where it should be. So this is being used as a means of smuggling in things under agenda. And the moral vampirism, as I call it, is the rolling out of that process to everything. So every issue that can be plundered for its moral cachet is infantilized, so that the mechanism is that the good people, you know, the people that are on message, the progressive people, all align with the infantilized position on the whole range of issues, and anyone that's disagreeing on any of them is denied any moral succor at all, because they're seen as, if you occupy the moral high ground on every issue, you deny the moral high ground to the opposition. So it makes everyone else look wicked. It's a manipulation of the social morality, and this is the key feature in the book and in the argument about how this works. The confusing thing about morality is it's an ambiguous word, because actually there are two moralities. There's what I would call the true morality, or the natural morality, or the absolute morality, that is not mutable, that you can't manipulate, because, well, if you're a theist, you believe it comes from God, but you don't have to be a theist to believe in a true or natural morality. You can believe it has an origin, a transcendent origin, maybe, but not necessarily a theistic one. Many people now don't believe there is such a thing, which helps the moral infantilism process, because the other morality, which is completely different, is what I call the social morality. And this is a set of norms of behaviours that become adopted and become agreed in a given society. And it's clear that this is not an absolute. It's clear that it is relative to the particular society, because you look at different societies around the world and they have different social moralities. What is perfectly acceptable in one will get you into deep trouble in another, and vice versa. Because the social morality can be changed according to how that society has evolved and so forth. So the social morality, which is what people think of as being moral, many people anyway, that's what guides their sense of morality. So this observation creates a mechanism for a very powerful means of manipulating a population by a political axis who has a vested interest in distorting the moral perspective in a way that aligns with their agenda. So to show how far this can go in a society, you can just look at things like Black Lives Matter, for example. Not just Black Lives Matter, but critical race theory generally, of which that's an example, where now we find the amazing situation where people that subscribe to that view, which many people now regard as the correct view, because every time you see footballers taking the knee, they're subscribing effectively to the critical race theory agenda. But that, in that school of thought, it's been infantilized to the extent where they would see Martin Luther King as being a racist, because his view that you should judge a man by the content of his character, not the colour of his skin, they would now repudiate as a form of sexism, as a form of racism. That's how crazy it becomes. That's how far you can distort the public perception of morality, because a lot of people are now subscribing to that view, which is wholly wrong from my point of view. I think from the point of view of a true morality, which is not mutable, then you should indeed judge people as individuals on the strength of their character, not any identity characteristic, be it colour of their skin or anything else. So this mechanism, this moral infantilism, moral usurpation mechanism, is very powerful, and it can make people believe things which perhaps 10, 20 years ago they would not have ever considered believing, but it can be morphed with clever use of particularly the media. If you have control of the media and you have control of the education establishments and the academia, then you've got the populace at your mercy in terms of being infantilized.
If we've got people they're kind of on board with the whole this message, but suddenly they come across one that really jars them, do they then kind of leave the whole, they jump the whole ship, or do they change themselves and just keep on with agreeing to the message?
It varies with the person. I mean, sometimes you find that, well, mostly people try and rationalise the position and bring the position around to something that they do find aligns with their newfound sense of morality. Other times, though, people may be brought round, and you do see this. I mean, people that I would describe in political terms as being the soft left. You see a lot of them now running away from woke. And I've seen friends of mine who might always have been right of centre but moderate right, now adopting what I would call political Christianity as a way of distancing themselves from the way the culture's going. So you see it on both sides, but it's definitely sort of, there's a polarisation, because at the same time people are already fairly hard, progressive or whatever you want to call them, are getting ever more extreme. And there's more of them, of course, as we see with what's happening in Scotland with the Gender Recognition Act, which, I mean, that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. And yet now it's mainstream politicians pushing it. It's quite incredible.
So it happened with the COVID, it seemed. There was a while where everyone followed along, and now a lot of those people who were following along, at least from people I know, suddenly have quite an opposing view, and I can't believe I did that. I don't really know what happened. Almost they get swept along with some kind of wave.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think some people are beginning to change their mind, and in a way, in a horrible, bleak way, actually, given that so many people have died, the COVID example may provide an opportunity to open people's eyes to this issue, as long as they can see it not just in the context of one disease, but in the broader context of the whole sort of moral usurpation issue. Whether that happens or not, I don't know. But yeah, certainly more people are waking up to it. I think even people, in the medical fraternity who were initially pushing vaccines have now decided that, just a minute, there's real evidence out there that they're not as safe as they should be. So yeah, there are a number of people changing their mind, but not everyone. I mean, you know, I think most of my ex-colleagues are still happily taking booster shots and wearing, they would no doubt wear masks again at a shot if they were told to. Yeah, so there's still a long way to go, I'm afraid, on that one. But yeah, the handling of COVID was a perfect example of moral usurpation.
So this wokeism or destructivism or whatever we call it is quite a powerful force at the moment. We see politicians who used to be fairly rational or seemed fairly rational, and suddenly they kind of go woke. Yeah. Even institutions like the police seem to be kind of signing up. Is this a conscious decision on their part, or are they getting swept along with a kind of current in society? How do we understand it?
It's mostly getting swept along. There will be a few more knowing actors, particularly at senior levels, and particularly at global, international levels, that they are more knowing, they more know what they're pushing. But mostly it's people getting swept along in a system. In the case of the police do what they're trained to do. So for the police, it's coming from above them. So the key mechanism here is that's driving the popularity at the senior levels in political circles and so on, is what I call the woke industrial complex. Well, actually, that's a term I stole from Vivek Ramaswamy from his book Woke Inc., which I strongly recommend, by the way. But I borrowed that term, but I've made it more specific to the moral usurpation axis. So it's worth going into that in some detail, because I think it sheds light on how the system works at a number of different levels. What you've got to appreciate is this is all about power. It's all about political power or other forms of power. And there's in the book I talk about 4 different forms of power. One is what you would normally think of as power, which is political or civic power. So that's the power to be able to make laws, it's the power to be able to impose taxes, it's the power to control police forces and armies, it's all that stuff, the governmental stuff. But then there's money, is another form of power. And there's control of information, which is, knowledge is power, as we know. But then there's the 4th form of power, which is the one that people have hitherto overlooked, and which I'm really bringing to the party in this book, and that is moral power. That is the manipulation of the social morality. That is also a form of power. That's very important. It's been overlooked, and yet it's very important, because if you think about it, the poor old elites, they've had a problem over the years and decades and centuries, because there's not many of them and there's a lot of the rest of us, and yet they manage to implement policies which are disadvantageous to the rest of us, and they get away with it. Why is that? It's not a matter of imposing it by force. It's not a matter of policing people's conformance to a system. It's enabled through the social morality. Absolutely key, and this has always been the case. It's not new. If you think back in time, when we had a very rigid class structure, even perhaps as far back as the feudal period, but you don't have to go back that far. When we had this class structure, there was a perception of, or an ethos of knowing your place. And that was part of the social morality. You should know your place. You were born into a place, and that's what you should be happy with. Because if you tried bettering yourself, then that was morally reprehensible, and you would be censured for it, and you'd be regarded as an imposter. So this aspect of social morality and the way in which it's underpinned the elite power structure has been massively overlooked. But that's what I'm really pointing to. So there we have the 4 sources of power. And then in this system of the woke industrial complex, there are three, I call it the triumvirate of powers. There's three groupings that wield those sources of power. One is, of course, government. The other is the corporate axis, which includes the globalists. But the third one is the intellectual clerisy, or the ideological clerisy even. So that is the education system, the universities, the academy, the media, the entertainment business, the arts centre. So, and if you think about it, they all have different access to different types of those four types of power. So obviously government axis is the governmental civic power and some access to money. For the corporate axis, it's money big time that they have access to. And now, thanks to big tech, they also have a control over information. And then the intellectual clerisy have a monopoly on the moral right. That's their big, and they produce the content for information. So you see the symbiosis here. They all have different forms of power, and they're all interested in power. So what you have, in effect, is a trading relationship between them, because the intellectual clerisy wants funding. They want money, and they get money from government and corporations. And what do government and corporations get back from them? They get the moral standing. It puts them on the moral high ground if they follow that agenda.
It feels that the big players in this third group are maybe quite different in the last 10 years than they used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's particularly in terms of social media. But this is why it's not only the universities have gone woke, but corporations have gone woke, and the politicians have gone woke, because that's how it works. Going woke is just their means of access to the moral high ground. That's what it is. But the moral infantilism is crucial, because it's actually not real morality. It's not real morality that any genuinely religious person, for example, would recognise as real morality. It's infantilized to serve the purposes of keeping the woke industrial complex going as the power centre. So it ultimately comes down to self-interest. It's not just about money, although money is a big part of it. It's also about people's career advancement and just looking good and having status in society. So that's how the elites hang on to their power. And part of it, by the way, part of the infantilization process is automatically the creation of in-groups and out-groups. That's always been a part of the elites holding on to power, because divide and conquer remains the most common and the best strategy. If you're a small force trying to defeat a big force, you try and create division in the big force. So creating division amongst the masses is the basic strategy. And by adopting moral infantilism, they create division in society, because only some people are willing to be infantilized. Only some people are willing to go along with that agenda. Some of us, you and I perhaps, are not. So there is created the in-group and the out-group by that mechanism. And that also, this is the key bit really, of which people overlook. We are being played. We are being played because that division also helps the elites. Now that doesn't mean to say I think we should stop opposing these wicked ideas that are not aligned with the moral right. But it's important to recognise that the division between us and those that swallow the agenda is part of what keeps the elites in power by keeping the public divided. We're being played.
It's the idea that the messages used to kind of control are these kind of infantilized moral messages, suggestive that society is kind of dumbed down somewhat.
Yes, and it's morally dumbed down specifically, not necessarily intellectually. But the morals, the moral psyche lives within the emotional psyche. That's another important point to grasp. It's not really rational. It lives in the emotional psyche. And the work of Jonathan Haidt and co-workers is very good on this. So, yes, people have been made receptive to this moral infantilization by having their capacity to think in genuine moral terms etiolated. And that has come about by the loss of a moral anchor. You see, people find it easy if they have moral guidance. They have a training in genuine morality. Rather than, otherwise they have to discover it for themselves. I mean, we're not all Buddha, are we? We're not all Jesus Christ. We can't all discover absolute morality for ourselves. So having guidance in that respect is the key thing. And whether that comes from religion or elsewhere doesn't really matter. But religion was the traditional source of moral anchorage. And so it's no accident that this rise of moral infantilism has come hand in hand with the decline of religion. And it's no accident that, say, the religious right in the USA are the ones that are opposed to the infantilization on the left. Of course, all religions themselves are a human institution as opposed from the transcendent reality behind them. So all religions themselves can be traduced to serve the purposes of a false morality, because there is humans involved in it. But at least they form a moral anchor that will frustrate the opportunity of bad actors to weaponize people's perception of morality in the wrong direction, even if the religion doesn't anchor you at the optimal port, as it were. It's better to be anchored than adrift on the moral ocean.
So what is the end goal of this destructivism, and who ultimately benefits from it?
So in terms of the end goal, it will vary according to who you're talking about. I don't think for most people that are benefiting this system, they actually actively want to impose some new socio-political regime. But there are those that do. And this is where the globalist technocratic axis is the most pernicious. Because although there is a psychological origin to the contagiousness and popularity of this, the directing, the source of direction comes from the top down. And bodies like the United Nations, World Economic Forum, and all the ancillary organisations like the IMF, World Bank, etc., play the part in this, because they're all very much aligned with an agenda which is going to profit from the rise of this system. And you see this in the policies being pursued, such as ESG, environmental, social and governance, the WEF's stakeholder capitalist initiative is an alliance between the corporate axis and the political axis, in effect. So it's consolidating that woke industrial complex. And so they definitely have a vested interest in it, and it's all wrapped up in, ultimately, global governments, world government in effect, but not by an elected body. Because the thing you can point to that is all these bodies have in common is they're not elected. We can't vote somewhere to get rid of them. So it's an undermining of democracy, and it's being enacted through this globalist axis, which has attained power, which is supranational power, really by stealth. I didn't appreciate this until relatively recently, but it's gone a long way already. And it's because they pick out individuals that look like they're going somewhere in national politics, and they effectively groom them in the system. That's what Davos is all about. It's a grooming system. But it's an undermining of democracy. This axis has always been against the nation state. It sees the nation state as being the source of all evil. Whereas actually, it may well be that the nation state is the only thing that will save us from them. And we have to reinforce our sovereignty, but hey, we've been singing that tune since Brexit days, and there's a long way to go. I admit I was a bit naive in Brexit days. I thought Brexit alone would help us a great deal, but I'd underestimated the globalist influence then. There's a great deal more of these organisations than just the EU, and they still have a great deal of power over us.
With a lot of these issues, they seem to trace back to kind of communist movements of the olden days. I remember Marcuse talking about tolerance is a source of oppression and to be intolerant. And I get the impression from your book that it's the intolerant that kind of win the culture war, or at least win the battles in the culture war.
Yes and no. That particular chapter in the book is me trying to explain what I did in a paper that I published in a journal of mathematical sociology based on evolutionary game theory, which is an algebraic model. So this is playing to my background in physics, of course. And you won't understand this you won't get this from the original paper because I was careful the way I phrased it. What I had in mind was identity politics, but I didn't phrase it in that way. I phrased it in a very academic way. As what happens if you have two groups of people where individuals are not recognisable, but only group membership is recognisable, and they're jockeying for dominance in some sense. And you can model that with game theory by having the individuals play each other in a notional game and either winning or losing. And according to whether that group as a whole does well and wins a lot or not, they will thrive by increasing in their proportion. So it's like evolution in the sense that if you're fit for your environment, you'll thrive, and if you're not fit, you'll gradually fade away. So you can model that. And of course, what I was really thinking is I was modelling identity politics, because the game then can be seen as a conflict between two worldviews or two opinions, and which one's coming out on top. And what happens was incredibly interesting. It took me by surprise, so much so that I put it to one side for a couple of years because I thought I must have made a mistake in the algebra. And then I came back to it and checked it again and again and again and again, and then ran numerical models. And it turns out that no matter what parameters you use, because there are a lot of different parameters you can feed in, it doesn't matter what parameters you use, as you were indicating there, the more intolerant wins. In other words, in game theory, typically it's like the prisoner's dilemma, if you're familiar with that. The prisoner's dilemma is where two people have been arrested, taken into separate rooms for interrogation, and the game is that if they both keep quiet, they'll get the minimum sentence, right? But if one of them keeps quiet and the other one talks, then the one that keeps quiet gets a really, really big sentence, and the one that turns Queen's evidence is let go. On the other hand, if they both talk, they get somewhere in the middle. So they get a heavier sentence than if both kept quiet. But clearly a lot worse than if one of them turned Queen evidence and the other one didn't. So the sort of paradox, it's not really a paradox, but the odd thing about the prisoner's dilemma is they're both going to gain if they cooperate, right? Because the alternative is they both turn Queen's evidence and then they both go down for longer than they would. But what would you do if you cooperate and the other one squeals? then you're really going to go down for an awful long time. So whatever the other guy does, you're better off if you talk. And so the logic of that is you both talk, but then you end up both not doing as well as if you both stay quiet. And this is the paradox of cooperation, because if you cooperate with, and this is quite general, if you cooperate, very often you can both benefit from that. But if you've got a cooperating situation and you get a freeloader that comes along and takes advantage of you, he can make mincemeat out of you on that occasion, and you really get punished. So that's the basis of that's the sort of logic of the evolutionary game theory idea, which only you reinterpret, the sentence length as, if you cooperate, that's tolerance. If you renege, if you talk, then that's being intolerant. That's how you reinterpret it. So the intolerant always wins. The intolerant, the group that's more intolerant expands in the population till the other one goes extinct. In every case, remarkably, and actually that only puts a sort of algebraic gloss on what a lot of people have observed. The more intolerant wins. The more intolerant drives out the more tolerant. However,
I'm glad that's
if you stopped there, it would just be miserable. But what that really illustrates is, because remember, this only comes about if individuals are not recognisable, and if people are only the group membership is identified, not the individual. What really happens when you run game theory type simulations, either with real people or in computers, where individuals are recognisable, is what tends to happen is you get a variant on a tit-for-tat type behaviour, whereby if he cooperates with you and you cooperate with him, that's perfectly happy. That'll continue forever. But if you cooperate and he reneges on you, then the next time you're not going to deal with him. That's tit-for-tat. That is a typical sort of strategy. It's not quite as simple as that, but that's what it comes down to. And so in real situations where the individual is recognisable, it makes a huge difference, because individuals then come with a reputation. So you talk about the 4 R's here: the recognition of the individual, reputation, reward and retribution, something like that. So that's how humans manage to build very large scale, cooperative, harmonious societies without kinship. This is unique in the animal kingdom, I think. There are other animals, insects and social animals, that form large groups, but they're invariably based on kinship. So there's a genetic driver for that. But humans can form huge communities of multiple millions that get on, despite the occasional fracas. They're generally very cooperative. You go out on the street here and you're not seeing people fighting each other all the time. Maybe occasionally, but not that much. So this is remarkable, but this is how it happens. This is how it happens, through the recognition and reputation and so forth. It's not, our harmonious society isn't just enforced by the law. If the only thing you had was the law, that would be far too crude an instrument. Because you're not going to go running to the law because somebody's been nasty to you in the street. There's such a thing as common decency and politeness and so on. And people adopt this standard of behaviour. This is the social morality, of course. This is where it comes from. People adopt a common standard of behaviour, the social morality, because it evolves to be, this is the way this society cooperates with each other. But you have to be able to recognise individuals. That is the learning point from that analysis. Not that the most intolerant wins. The most intolerant wins if you don't recognise individuals. So if you go down the identity politics route, that's what you've got in front of you. Increasing intolerance. And we're seeing this. The other aspect of that, by the way, is schism. You may think the intolerant groups won because it's now the 100% of the population. But what happens is one subgroup within that group becomes a little bit more intolerant still. Then that will expand. So a schism will form, a separate group will form, and that new group, because it's more intolerant, will drive out the other one. You're seeing this now in feminism. Feminism schismed into intersectional feminism. Now it's schismed into trans. The poor old second wave feminists are now trans exclusionary radical feminists. They're TERFs, aren't they? So that's a schism, because just trans came from the feminist movement. Make no mistake, because it was the feminists that created our modern concept of gender. Without the feminists, that would not exist. So trans could not exist because we would not have that concept of gender. So trans is a schism of the feminist movement, and they're proving more intolerant than the previous feminists, and they're being cancelled. Poor old second wave feminists, Julie Bindel and all these people are being cancelled by them. That's an example of it in operation.
The left will eat itself is always the phrase, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. The revolution eats its own. That's what it is. That's exactly what it is. But the antidote to it is Martin Luther King. It's to recognise the individual and the merits of the individual, not the colour of his skin. In other words, not the identity group. That is the antidote to what's actually happening, which is social atomisation and breakdown. It's because of the rise of identity politics, and identity politics is the division that's caused by moral infantilism. That's how it all glues together.
Your previous book, The Empathy Gap, was evidence, like 900 pages of evidence, whereas this book is a lot more opinion-based, which is quite unusual for someone of your scientific background.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to do it in this more opinion-based way?
Well, one reason is I wrote that book from first word to publication in 4 months, and I was driven by a sense of extreme urgency. So I wanted to get down on paper what I thought the issues were that I've just been describing. And so that's one reason, but the other reason I was very well aware... Oh, by the way, I have not abandoned empiricism, far from it. The issues that I talk about can all be, they can all be addressed through empirical inquiry, and should be. One of them has, because the empathy gap is addressing one of those infantilized issues, namely women good, men bad, I suppose you could say. There's the infantilized issue there. But you could not possibly do that in one book, because the moral usurpation, woke industrial complex thing is an overarching it's an algorithmic system that many different applications are instances of. So, the gender issue is one. But as we've said, the COVID, handling of COVID is another. The climate change is another. The trans issue is another. And so it goes on. There's lots of... one of the chapters actually goes through, I don't know, half a dozen examples. Each one of those would require its own empathy gap, 700 pages book of going through the evidence. So take the COVID issue. Eminently possible to take the empirical approach to that, and people are doing. There's lots of stuff out there now on the individual elements that you'd have to bring together for the whole picture. So you'd have to look at masks. Do they work? If they don't work, did the government know they didn't work? If the government knew that, who knew what when? And if the government knew they didn't work, why did they impose them? Exactly. And what is the nudge unit? Is it morally acceptable to deploy psyops on a civilian population in peacetime? And lockdowns, do they work? And what was the evidence? Why was the epidemic policy that was in place thrown away in place of another one that was made up on the fly? The mechanism used to give emergency approval to the vaccines, by what standard was that acceptable? What was the standard? Is it written down? and so on. I mean, you know the issue. They go on and on in the case of COVID. It would probably be bigger than the empathy gap if you did that thoroughly. But that's how it can be approached empirically. All those things can be approached empirically where it's medical issues. There's bags of data out there in published papers on vaccine harms, for example, and all those other issues. And where it's more not quite so numerical, like the legitimacy of the PSYOPs unit, you can still address that empirically by asking, was it legal? If it's legal, where under what legislation is that legal? And if you decide, well, yeah, we can't say it's not legal, then is it ethical? And, get some proper ethicists on the job looking at that, and looking at the implications of it and what harms it's done, because that can be quantified. So there's the makings of truly enormous book there, and people are piecing it together, of course. And the same's true of climate changes and oh my goodness, that would be a whole suite of books on that one. But it's eminently approachable empirically. I mean, on both those topics, I've looked at them a bit, not anything like the degree of detail required to write a book. But I've looked at both those a bit, which is why I can say with some confidence they are instances of moral usurpation. I mean, the climate change thing is reduced to, are you in favour of trashing the planet or not? Because, if you're not in favour of trashing the planet, that means you favour net zero. That's the infantilism. I mean, that's a non sequitur, of course, obviously, but the infantilizers have actually been brought to believe that, incredibly. So, yeah.
So in terms of this destructivism that is happening, what can be done to make it better?
I think we need to keep talking about it. Just like my answer to the last interview in the context of the empathy gap, it's you need to be brave enough to speak out if in a measured but firm way. Because part of it is ignorance. Get over it. We've got to overcome. It's not people that are vested in it that we have to overcome here. It's the public that believe what they're being told, where we can make progress. You're not really going to make progress against the people that have a vested interest in continuing to pursue these lines. So we have to try and penetrate the public mind, but that's of course hard to do when you're not in possession of the main media, which is where things like this are very valuable. But we have to do our best, keep trying on that. And the other thing is, well, it depends what the future holds. At the moment, things are not looking good in terms of the way this agenda is playing out, because the globalist technocratic axis does seem intent on using these narratives to impose ever-increasing authoritarianism. That's the way it's looking. There's already intimations that freedom of movement is going to be constrained. Well, we've already seen that under COVID, but at a more local level with what's happening in Oxford, for example. Well, that may play into the hands of the opposition, because one of the things that I emphasised last time is the formation of local communities. Well, if you can't go more than 50 minutes walk from your home, that's going to encourage the formation of tighter local communities with a cohesive bond that they're all locked into the same canton, or whatever you're going to call it, together. So that is, again, something that might be beneficial. But we've got to wake up the bulk of the public who are still a million miles away from understanding what's going on. Not that I'm saying that my view of things is necessarily 100% right. It might not be. I hope I'm exaggerating. I hope. But the constant refrain of conspiracy theory every time you mention these issues is simply not good enough. I mean, we need to start replying to that, well, you're a complacency theorist, which is more dangerous. Because there's an awful lot of complacency. People think, well, I live in a free, liberal, democratic society. And they don't understand the extent to which our democracy has already been undermined, because it's been leached away into foreign bodies. So it's not going to be easy, but, you know, ultimately, since this is all about moral usurpation, really, in my estimation, the real level at which you have to fight it is that. It's the moral level. You have to undermine it at the moral level. Live not by lies, as somebody said. You have to the most important thing is maintaining your own personal integrity and commitment to virtues. I know it sounds very pious, but that is the way to go. That is the antidote. Live not by lies, and keep your eye fixed on true moral rectitude, and not this artificial bowing and scraping to the agenda, which is appalling.
Rick Bradford, thanks for joining us again on British Thought Leaders.
My pleasure.